Danny here, and today we are going to be talking about tannins. So grab a glass of red wine if you can, and let's get started. Okay, so I've got my glass of Cabernet Sauvignon here, which I'm going to take a sip of in just a second. But first I want to go over what tannins are, because I think there is a ton of confusion out there when people are talking about wine and talking about tannins. So scientifically put, tannins are just chemical compounds that we find in our wine. They come mostly from skins of grapes, which is why they are most prevalent in red wines. But they can also come from the seeds or the stems of grapes as well. And then we can get a little bit of tannin from oak, but not as much as you think. I think a lot of people attribute tannins to oak like way more than what they are. So they're mostly coming from the grapes. So you can't see tannins, so never look at your glass of wine and be like, oh, check out those tannins. You can't smell them either, so don't be like, I smell those tannins. So no seeing or smelling of tannins. Actually, you can't even taste tannins either. And some people will disagree with me, but just honestly, in all of my research, the most credible sources out there agree that tannins are just contributors to the mouthfeel of a wine, not the actual taste of wine. So if you take a sip of your red wine, and if you put your tongue on top of your mouth and just kind of move it around a little bit, you'll feel some grittiness. That's what tannin is. If you don't have wine in front of you and you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, think about a time that maybe you had some black tea that was steeped for way too long and you drink it and it's really bitter and astringent. That's tannin. That is tannin to a T right there. And no, we do not want them in our teas. However, we want them in our wines. Tannin can just attribute positively to the entire mouthfeel of the wine and just give our wine a little bit more structure. So tannins provide that astringency component. We might be able to say that it is the drying effect of red wine in our mouths. However, I don't want you to get this confused with dry wines. It's the number one mistake I see people making when they're talking about wine with me, is they say they don't really like dry wine. Well, 90% of the wines out there are dry, because when we're talking about dry wine, we're talking about wines that don't have any sugar in them, which is 90% of the wines out there. So pretty much, the majority of wines out there are dry. So when we're talking about tannins, we can talk about the drying effect, but we don't actually refer to them as dry wines, if that makes sense. Tannins can technically be in white wines. However, when we're talking about wine lingo, we really never even bring up tannins in white wines because they're so rare. When it comes to white wines, they're not coming into any contact with the skins of the grapes, so they really shouldn't be tannic. So please never mention tannins when you're talking about white wine. Some grapes are naturally higher in tannins than others, so the Cabernet Sauvignon that I'm sipping on today is naturally high, and Syrah can be naturally high in tannin, and then the top two really are Tannat and Nebbiolo. So if you don't know what tannins are, get yourself a glass of Tannat or Nebbiolo and you will definitely know what they are with that. So although those four grapes are the highest, we can always get tannin in other wines. So for example, Pinot Noir is usually pretty low in tannin. However, I tasted one the other day that was like crazy tannin. And that's because the winemaker utilized whole cluster fermentation, meaning he put all of the stems into the fermenting tanks with the Pinot Noir grapes, which added a ton of tannin. So it was really interesting. So don't think that wines will never be tannic if they're a certain varietal. They can always get some tannin in them. Okay, so there's your lesson on tannins. Let me know in the comments below whether you like or hate them. I think our palates are always changing, and there was a time where I loved tannic wine. Now I prefer them to be a little bit more integrated, but everybody's different, right? Wine is subjective, and that's what's so fun about it. So make sure to hit subscribe to get all of my future videos, and I will see you in the next lesson. Bye.